Hey everyone, it's Jakov, and instead of covering Total War Rise of Mordor like I typically do, I'm going to be doing a video on the Last Alliance Total War. This is a mod for Total War Shogun 2 set in the Second Age of Middle-earth, in comparison to Rise of Mordor, which is set in the late Third Age, so imagine this as a spiritual prequel of sorts. Currently, the mod is still very much in development, being in the version 0.2.4 alpha. While they may be somewhat early in the mod's development, there's still a fair bit of content to see in the mod, with several factions and a small campaign being ready to play. For those of you interested in the mod, I'm going to leave it linked in the description, and I do encourage you to play. Today's video, however, will be a faction breakdown, with me going over a faction's history within both the books and films of Tolkien's universe, before looking at the civilizations that inspired them in real life. After that, I'm going to look at the faction's units and break them down, covering their battlefield roles as well as looking at their equipment and seeing how historically authentic it is. Now that you know what mod we're looking at, and what the video itself is going to cover, let's start by going over the general overview of today's faction, the Haradrim Black Snake Clan. The Haradrim are the human inhabitants of the southern desert and jungle regions of Middle-earth, who are known for being separated into different tribal groups vying with each other for supremacy during the Third Age. In the Second Age, it was no different, with many choosing to back Sauron and oppose the elves and Númenóreans after being colonized by that great seafaring race, many seeing Sauron as their deliverance from subjugation, loyally serving him in his conflicts against the free peoples of Middle-earth. The Black Snake Clan, to my knowledge, isn't a clan that's mentioned by name in Tolkien's work, although I may be completely wrong, and if I am, please let me know in the comments. Me personally seeing them more as a representation of just how separate the Haradrim were among each other. In the films, you never see the Haradrim of the Second Age, although in the books it's mentioned that many men fought for Sauron in the War of the Last Alliance at the end of the Second Age, so you can infer that the Black Snake Clan fought there, the snake itself being a very common Haradrim symbol. In terms of historical cultures that inspired the Haradrim Black Snake Clan, I say the different tribal groups of the Middle East and North Africa mostly, especially the nomadic groups of the region such as the Bedouin. With the historical background of the faction and its history in and out of text looked at, let's begin to make our way towards its units. Unlike Rise of Mordor, in which generals can sometimes be more elite units that can be used multiple times in one army, the generals in this mod are unique, with each faction generally only possessing about 2 generals. The first general for the Black Snake Clan is the Serpent Guard. This unit of shock cavalry are very heavily armoured, rider and horse being covered in armour from head to toe. Looking at the horses, they have scale barding covering practically their entire body and head, such armour being widely used in history by various groups such as the Cataphracts of the Byzantine Empire, the Parthian Empire, and the Sassanid Empire, as well as heavy cavalry deployed by countless other groups ranging in area from the Mediterranean to East Asia, such armour being great at keeping horses protected from projectiles and spears while maintaining some degree of mobility and cutting down on weight. Turning to the riders, each man wears a faceted conical helmet that greatly reminds me of nasal helms of both Islamic and European design, as well as acorn-style helmets utilised by the Ottomans, the helmets having cheek guards and nose guards which in universe resemble the helmets of the Númenóreans, implying the sharing of technology between both peoples. All these features are reminiscent of real-life Anglo-Saxon helmets, Viking helmets, and Sipahi helmets. Finally, the helmets have a gilded snake as part of their nasal guard, which was something done in history by affluent warriors who wished to peacock their wealth by adorning their armour in decoration as long as it didn't inhibit their combat abilities for the most part. Underneath their helmets, each man wears a male coif and aventail, which protects the neck and upper torso. For their body, each warrior wears a scale coat with the appropriate rider split, this being the main protection for their bodies over their silken robes. Protecting their arms, each man wears a manica, overlapping plates of armour covering the arm, highly reminiscent of those utilised by Roman troops and certain gladiator types, such as the heavy Crupulari. For their hands, they have leather gloves and their feet are protected by leather riding boots, or strapped onto their backs are wicker frameworks, much like those used by the Haradrim of the Third Age, but also the wicker structures used by tribal warriors in Southeast Asia and parts of Africa, as well as the Polish hussars of the early modern era. For shields, each man has a large round wooden shield covered with leather or rawhide, with symbols painted on top, symbols of the sun and snakes mainly, both classic Haradrim symbols. The shields have metal nails included into their framing, which makes sense and was done historically to give shields greater strength and durability in combat. Shields for such armoured troops make a lot of sense, as it was only really when men began covering themselves entirely in plate that shields were generally discarded by heavy cavalry and infantry. For their weapons, all in the unit wield one-handed swords for melee, the swords having no guards while looking a lot like traditional arrow blades which were actually straight, these weapons looking to be dedicated cutters rather than thrusters, much like their historical counterparts. The main weapon used by each man, of course, is the lance, which all have wavy tips looking like a flambeau sword, suggesting these lances can cut somewhat, although in reality, lances were designed to punch through armor rather than cut enemies. Looking at who I'm assuming is the unit officer, is equipped identically to his men, except his helmet looks identical to the nasal helms used by Arab warriors in the Crusades, having a gilded nasal guard and the symbol of a cobra atop the helmet, implying that this man himself is the Serpent, or a vassal of the Serpent. Covering his face, the unit officer has a veil rather than cheek guards, something often worn by troops operating in arid environments. Looking at who I'm guessing is the unit standard bearer next to him, he has a massive banner emblazoned with the symbol of the black snake on the framing on his back, his frame being topped with lance heads rather than the wood or wicker of the regular warriors in the unit. As a unit, these guys are the cheaper option of general when playing as the Black Snake Clan, and can put in a lot of good work, being very good at countering other mounted generals and being perfect for running down range generals, being a good unit overall. That said, the next unit coming up does overshadow them somewhat. The second general option for the Black Snake Haradrim are the Great Shah Guard, a unit of very heavy shock cavalry, which I'm assuming are the personal bodyguards of the clan's leader rather than his subordinates. Looking at the steeds of the unit, they're all heavily armoured in a similar fashion to the previous unit, being equipped as cataphracts with scale barding, making the horse very sturdy and quite well defended from both projectiles and handheld weapons like spears. Turning to the riders, each man is heavily armoured, wearing what's either a segmented nasal helm, or a helm with etchings meant to resemble segmented plates, capped with small spikes and adorned with snake-shaped nasal guards like those of the previous unit. Attached to these helmets, each warrior has either a scale or mail coif and aventail protecting the face, throat and upper torso, in a style similar to that worn by some Vikings and Eastern European warriors in the early Middle Ages, such as the Avars, having a lot of Eastern influence. Protecting their torsos, they wear a variety of scale and lamellar hauberks, with proper rider splits over flowing pants and robes, although their legs are unarmoured, lacking greaves and sabatons, while their arms have leather gloves and the same manica for defence as the serpent guards. Attached to each rider, of course, are the same frames bearing banners, while in terms of equipment they have the same swords, shields and wavy lances as the serpent guards. Looking at the Shah himself, he is equipped quite differently from his men, his helmet being adorned with a snake crest atop it, and a snake being carved into the helmet, the helmet itself looking much like a Phrygian helm of antiquity, although the crossed bars protecting his face aren't something I've ever seen before, the helmet being reinforced with additional plating, while a bronze aventail and coif protects his face and neck, bronze tassels also hanging down from the side of his head, his face being covered with red fabric. Turning to his body armour, he wears a silken shirt and pants over which he has what's either bronze plate or bronze gilded plate making up the bulk of his protection, his upper torso being protected by a gorget overlaid over his coif, while the rest of his chest is covered with a plate cuirass bearing the symbol of the black snake, such armour being reminiscent of the bronze plate used during the Bronze Age collapse by warriors such as the Mycenaeans, somewhat being like what Achilles' armour would have been like had he existed. Protecting his legs, he has large plates strapped to them, such armour also having ancient origins, while his arms have plate bands covering the upper arm and snake-decorated vambraces for the forearms. In addition to all this plate, the Shah has wicker pauldrons which are a nice nod to the wicker armour widely used by the Haradrim in the Third Age, although such a prominent being using such pedestrian armour is a bit odd, although it could be a concession to personal tastes, while on his back he has a large black serpent banner hanging from his lance-tipped framework. In terms of equipment, the Shah uses an oval shield which reminds me of the Roman scutum, his shield having a bronze rim decorated with engraved serpents, such rims being historically accurate as the Romans did use them in comparison to Heda shields, which are often inaccurately depicted with rims, the shields also having what I'm guessing is an enamelled black serpent emblazoned in the centre of the shield, making for one impressive artifact. For a sword, rather than the straight blades of his men, the officer uses a curved blade which looks like a stereotypical scimitar of pop culture, actually looking to be inspired with a Persian shamshir, having a lot of weight at the end of the blade, making for a devastating cutter, while the hilt is in a shape of a serpent eating its own tail, which I believe is called a Ouroboros, making a fully connected knuckle bow to protect the hand. Moving away from the equipment of the unit and turning to its role on the battlefield, it's the best general that the faction can field, being one of the most devastating units in the game on the charge, while being so heavily armoured that it can absorb an immense amount of punishment and keep on fighting and winning, although its melee abilities, like all shock cavalry, could be better, given the unit's main intent are shock charges, not slugfests, a great unit that I recommend using when playing as the Black Snake Clan. Moving from the elite of the clan, we come to its lowliest members and the first spear unit available to the faction, the Tribesmen Spearmen. These warriors are little more than rallied villagers and their equipment and combat prowess reflect that, having absolutely no armour, using turbans to protect their heads, although turbans are actually somewhat useful at lessening the impact of slashes to the head, the rest of their accoutrement just being their daily shirts and skirts, or for shields, they use a mix of large wicker shields and wooden planks tied together with rope, such shields very much being used in real life by tribal warriors and levies for centuries, which makes sense given such fighters rarely engage in large-scale conflicts, and instead expected at most to fight in small intertribal conflicts with little in the way of actual battle and death. For weapons, each man uses a spear with a large rounded tip, much like the spears utilized by the Zulus, being both good at stabbing and slashing while also being easily converted from wartime weapons to daily hunting equipment in the wastes of Harad. One thing to note about the spearmen is that they appear far darker than the men in the general units we've looked at, which may be an indication that the leading elements of the Black Snake Clan may be an elite racial minority, or the bulk of the tribesmen are a different ethnicity, something often seen in many cultures, e.g. the Norman nobility of medieval England compared to the Anglo-Saxon bulk of the population. I believe this unit lacks an officer, so I'm going to skip to the unit role, which is essentially being an early building block for the faction, giving you troops capable of at the very least matching up to rabble units, their ability to make spear walls somewhat counter in cavalry, although they should provide little in the way of defense against ranged units. Overall, a useful unit, but one which should be very much replaced as quickly as possible. Moving up from the tribesmen spearmen, we have the desert warriors, which are far more formidable troops on the battlefield. For armour, they wear a mix of helmets akin to those of the serpent guards along with face veils, while some just wear turbans for head protection, while each man wears a backing cuirass over their robes, on top of which are segmented metal plates, while the upper legs of each man are protected by fabric folds with segmented plates attached to them. While such armour isn't as extensive or as ornate as the equipment of the general units, such segmented plate was commonly used during the Middle Ages, especially during the transition from mail armour to plate armour, as armourers experimented with different ways of increasing the protection of their customers, this armour providing a good amount of protection for the desert warriors, while also not impeding them in desert environments to a large degree, the way other armour would. Surprisingly, the desert warriors discard shields, instead choosing to rely on their armour and their weapons to see them through battle. Each man wields a tasseled glaive with a blade engraved with the symbol of the clan, glaives being quite effective as slashing weapons, while also being useful at fending off cavalry, although these blades are quite thick and chunky, suggesting they'd be devastating in melee against enemy infantry. Turning to the unit officer, he wears the same Numenorian-inspired helmet that the Serpent Guards do, along with a mail coif, while his body is protected by a scale hauberk with a rider split, which may suggest this is a dismounted nobleman, his arms being covered with mail sleeves over which are banded van braces, such van braces seeing common use before full-plate van braces developed. Attached to his back, the unit officer has the typical wicker standard, while he follows the trend of his men and disguises his shield, using the same glaive as his subordinates in battle. As a unit, the Desert Warriors are far better troops than the tribesmen spearmen, and should be a priority when building armies in the early to mid-game, as the unit puts in serious work, being a large component of your infantry forces, holding the line against the enemy and fending off marauding cavalry. A very useful unit which performs well even if its prowess is somewhat limited by its lack of shields. Moving up from the Desert Spearmen, we come to the truly professional infantry of the Black Snake Clan, the Serpent Spearmen. These heavy spearmen are well armoured, the bulk of the unit choosing to use mail coifs in conjunction with turbans for head protection, a very common practice especially when fighting in desert environments, with some using the same Numenorian-inspired helmet as previous units, while also wearing mail coifs and aventails as a way of protecting their upper torsos. For body armour, they use scale and lamellar hauberks extending to the knees over the top of their flowing clothes, although the armour has a rider split for some reason which doesn't make sense for dedicated infantry. Protecting their arms, the men have banded van braces, while their upper arms have segmented rear braces for protection, with a standard wicker frame on their back finishing off their appearance. For weapons, each man wields a spear with the same wavy tip as the lance, the tips being absolutely massive, being more like a sword blade mounted on the top of a pole than a spear tip, making for a spear that seems as if it would be very unbalanced. In conjunction with this spear, each man uses an ovoid shield similar to the oval Roman scutum, rimmed with metal and emblazoned with symbols of snakes and suns, the two cutouts on the side of the shield resembling those on the shields of the elves, perhaps indicating some slight exchange between both peoples. Moving to the unit officer, he has a standard officer helm and coif combination in addition to a hauberk of scales, his arms being protected by manica while wielding the same shield and spear as his men. Turning to the unit's role on the battlefield, these guys will be the core of your army from the mid-game to the end-game, placing the Desert Warriors to be your bulwark in battle against which enemy forces are broken, making for a mighty spear line. With their shields in addition to their weapons and their armor, this unit can handle most of anything that's thrown at it within reason, being a leading unit in the Haradrim roster. Moving on from the Serpent Spearmen, we come to a unique unit that can be considered the peak of the Black Snake Clan's potential when it comes to spearmen, the Horror of the Desert. It may come as a surprise looking at these men, but they're a spear unit in spite of the bows that they wield, actually being a unique unit that combines the Haradrim prowess with ranged warfare with their indomitable spearmen. Looking at their equipment, they wear a variety of helmets, coifs and turbans, all being equipment we've seen before. For their armour, they wear scale or lamellar hauberks, while their arms are completely covered in manica, although like all Haradrim units, they don't use greaves. On their backs they have the standard framework in addition to the standard Haradrim oval shield which is slung on their backs until the unit engages in melee, giving them a greater measure of protection when operating as archers. For weapons, they use the recurve bow, the legendary weapon wielded by countless peoples across centuries, but most famously by steppe archers such as the Mongols, who used the weapon to devastating impact in their wars of conquest. Seeing such a weapon in the hands of these men makes sense, not only given the heritage of the weapon in real life, but also because as a unit that's expected to serve as infantry, having a full-length longbow in addition to a shield and a spear makes for an unwieldy soldier, so using a more compact weapon makes a lot of sense, the tips of the bows being shaped into snakes as you'd expect from this particular faction, while their spear is the same one seen before. Looking at this unit officer, he is equipped identically to his men, having a snake-engraved helmet. On the battlefield, the Horror of the Desert make for amazing archers and difficult to break spearmen, being highly effective at both their roles to the point that they can beat top-tier units of both categories when facing off against them, their armor allowing them to absorb considerable punishment in a shootout, while their ranged abilities allow them to whittle down enemy melee units before engaging them. Honestly, an entire army of these guys would be a terrifying sight, though they are quite expensive, and while good against cavalry when in formation, can be vulnerable when caught out of formation. I definitely recommend expanding their presence in late game armies where possible, though I'd argue that when using the other units in the roster correctly, they're not really that necessary the way other units are, being more of a win more unit than anything else. With the elite Horror of the Desert looked at, all of the Haradrim Black Snake Clan spear line have been covered, so let's move on to their melee infantry. Looking at the first unit in that category, we have the Haradrim Fencers. Armor-wise, these troops are identical to the Desert Warriors, so we won't focus on their armor. For weapons, they use the same traditional Arab-inspired straight one-handed sword with no guard, while for a shield they use a round buckler strengthened with rivets around the side and decorated with either symbols of snakes or of the sun. Turning to the unit officer, he has a traditional Numenorean-inspired helmet and coif in conjunction with a scale hauberk, his arms covered in mail sleeves and segmented vambraces, using the same sword and shield as his troops, being the only one in the unit to have framework on his back. In battle, this unit may not be the most powerful, but it gives the Haradrim some offensive capabilities, especially at lower levels where this unit can perform fairly well, though when facing off against heavy infantry, the unit is at a marked disadvantage. Quite useful as an early piece in a Haradrim army, but it should be phased out when necessary. Moving up from the Haradrim Fencers, we come to their more advanced brethren, the Serpent Fencers. Armor-wise, these men are equipped identically to the Serpent Spearmen, back frames and all, so I'm going to skip their armor and move on to their equipment. For swords, they use the same blades of the Haradrim Fencers, while their shields are likewise the same. Turning to their officer, he too is identical to his spear counterpart, except he uses lamellar rather than scale armor, using his men's shield and sword. Battlefield-wise, these men are the equivalent of the Serpent Spearmen, providing the faction with good quality swordsmen that are much needed in a faction that lacks melee infantry, these guys giving the faction at least a modicum of striking power in high-tier armies. A very useful unit which makes up the core of the faction's offensive infantry, and one which should be obtained as quickly as possible if victory when playing as the Black Snakes is something that you wish. With this unit looked at, all of the melee infantry of the faction, be they spearmen or swordsmen, have been covered, so let's move on to their ranged units. The lowliest of the faction's ranged units in terms of position, the Tribesmen Slingers are the ranged equivalent of the Tribesmen Spearmen, having the exact same armor, or lack therefore. For weapons, the men use leather slings, launching rocks at their enemies. Slings, despite their simple nature, being incredibly effective weapons against armored and unarmored enemies alike, being a perfect example of a hunting or farming implement that found its calling in warfare. Slingers in the classical world being among the most feared skirmishers of the time, especially those hailing from the Balearic Isles. In conjunction with their simple slings, the unit used wicker and wooden bucklers, similar to the peltrists and slingers of antiquity, although they tended to use heavier shields than wicker. Finally, in case of melee combat, the men have daggers at their side, such weapons being perfect at finishing off enemies, although in pitched battle they're not quite ideal when armoured in such a manner. Seeing as this unit looks like it has no officer, we'll jump into its role. For an early game unit, the slingers are fantastic, giving the faction quite a lot of ranged power and options, making it a perfect combination with the tribesman spearmen, that unit holding the line while this unit brings its firepower to bear. That said, this unit is fragile when dealing with enemy projectiles, and cavalry will exterminate this unit on the spot. Great unit, and one which can stick around in a Haradrim army for a fair amount of time compared to other units. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Haradrim Archers, who use the exact same equipment as the Haradrim Fencers and Desert Warriors, wielding recurve bows instead to differentiate them from those units, along with nasty wooden cudgels and maces for hammering down foes in melee. With an officer who's what we've seen before, the only thing to discuss about this unit is its role. In battle, the Haradrim Archers are hardier units than the Slingers, who die in droves when facing off against determined ranged enemies. In comparison, this unit, which will make up the bulk of your ranged forces in low to mid-tier army builds, can absorb return fire to an acceptable degree and even engage in melee when necessary, although hopefully as a flanking unit rather than on the front lines. Not the mightiest archers in the world, even at their level the unit does adequate, which I think is the best term that encapsulates them. Moving to the final pure archer unit the faction can field, we find ourselves facing the Serpent Archers, the archer equivalent to the Serpent Spearmen and Fencers and equipment, using recurve bows as their main weapon in addition to the straight Haradrim blade for use in close combat. Skipping the unit officer, the Serpent Archers are the core of your professional ranged forces, being a match for the ranged units fielded by other factions and being armoured enough to absorb enemy fire and fight in melee when needed, being strong enough to fend off low-tier infantry. As a unit, they're only really eclipsed by the horror of the desert, who will generally supplement this unit rather than replace it outright. A good unit which is the foundation upon which the Haradrim affectation towards ranged combat is cemented. With this unit looked at, all the ranged units in the roster have been covered, leaving cavalry to be looked at last. Beginning with the least of the melee cavalry available to the Black Snake Clan, we have the Caravan Guards Riders, horsemen who ride unarmoured steeds and who themselves tend to be mostly unarmoured, having only turbans and what I'm assuming is padded armour akin to a gambeson for body armour, gambeson being a widely used type of armour throughout the Middle Ages, especially by lesser troops who couldn't quite gain access to metal armour or for whom metal armour was unnecessary, such as scouts. For shields, the men use a typical round buckler, while their weapons range from glaives to wavy spears, such weapons in the hands of light cavalry making sense compared to lancers, although glaives aren't quite a weapon for use on horseback as far as I know. The unit officer alone wears an acorn helm with cheek guards and a lamellar hauberk, wielding a shield and glaive. As a unit, these guys are lighter cavalry designed to run down enemy archers and give your armies mobility, something that's crucial for flexible strategies. The unit also being useful at fending off marauding light cavalry, though heavy cavalry is in a weight class of its own. A useful unit for early tier army builds, and one which will often be the hammer which you amass to charge the enemy from behind, being more than capable of breaking early game units. Moving on to the next mounted unit in the faction roster, we have the Haradrim Horse Archers. This unit of men ride unarmoured horses, the riders being equipped identically to the Haradrim Fencers, wielding the same blade for close combat and a recurve bow to use at range, the officer being identical to the Haradrim Fencer officer, except on horseback. As a unit, these guys can be the core of your army, giving you the option to convert to a solely cavalry force, whittling down slower enemy armies with superior firepower before breaking them with shock cavalry, essentially adopting steppe warfare and using it against the enemies of the Haradrim. Because this unit gives you that range striking power and is easily amassed, I consider this one of the most important units in the roster, as if another strategy is adopted, the unit can still be useful, provoking your enemies into reacting to your ploys rather than being proactive. A great unit as far as I'm concerned, which can shape the way you play the game to an immense degree. Moving on, we come to the Haradrim Riders, who are outfitted identically to the Horse Archers, except everyone, including the standard officer, uses glaives as their weapon, with bucklers on their arms for protection. Unit role-wise, in the mid-game, this unit will make up the core of your melee cavalry, being a unit meant for heavy combat if at a lesser level, compared to the Caravan Riders, which are glorified scouts, this unit doing quite well at boosting the hitting power of the Black Snakes, being more resilient to archers, spears and enemy cavalry than those who came before. Definitely a good unit to pick up, but not the be-all end-all when it comes to the mounted prowess in the Haradrim roster. Moving on to the next unit, the Serpent Lancers cut an intimidating figure, being mounted on unarmoured horses while the riders are essentially serpent fencers on horseback, wielding massive lances as their weapon, making for a true shock cavalry unit. Skipping the officer who we've seen repeatedly before, the unit will make up the core of your shock cavalry and late tier armies, being devastating against enemy archers and perfect for tearing apart enemy infantry, most likely using mass numbers to overwhelm any enemy cavalry before digging their lances deep into their enemies' backs. A great unit which will operate as the armoured fist of the Haradrim in most situations. However, the faction has one unit that puts it to shame, the Serpent Cataphracts, who are armoured essentially identically to the Shah Guard, both horse and rider being extensively covered in armour. A unit capable of being massed unlike the generals. When the cataphracts are deployed, almost nothing in the game stands a chance, although realistically, this unit will be the vanguard of your cavalry, meaning the spear tip, while the serpent lances provide the bulk of the lance. A very heavy unit which can defeat almost anything it charges into, though melee cavalry can pose a threat to it, especially when bogged down and surrounded by enemies. A great unit and one which will only ever be found in late tier armies, where a unit of this caliber is occasionally required to shift the tide of war in your favour. Looking at the Haradrim Black Snake Clan overall, they're a faction that very much relies on their spears to hold the line, while their archers are expected to weaken enemies to the point that their spears and limited swordsmen can force them into retreat, their cavalry coming into play when such a ploy is unviable, charging into the weakened enemy formations and sending them fleeing. The faction can also pivot from this strategy and become a mounted horde if necessary, creating their hardiness for mobility, making for an adaptable faction on the open battlefield, even if they are completely lacking in shock infantry. This flaw becomes readily apparent in sieges where the faction suffers, especially on the offensive, as it lacks units capable of punching holes in entrenched attackers the way other factions can. That said, that balances out the faction, securing it its own niche where it can excel and grow. If you've liked what you've seen, I ask you to like and subscribe. It might not seem like much, but for such a small channel, it'll truly be appreciated. More videos covering this mod as well as others will be coming in the future, but if you want to watch similar content in the meantime, I suggest you watch the other videos I've made so far. This is your host Jakov, signing off.